In a question and answer livestream, Christian YouTuber and apologist Mike Winger shared his answer to this question.
Why do Christians try to keep all 10 commandments to the word except the fourth one?
This video will critique two arguments of Mike, both of which utilize Paul's letter to the Romans, where he argues not only that the fourth commandment does not apply to Christians, but that none of the 10 commandments apply. Here is the first argument from Romans Mike makes.
We are not under the law, and that includes the 10 commandments. However, that does not mean we don't have any moral commitments that agree very much with many things found in the law and in the 10 commandments. But by saying I'm not under the law, including the 10 commandments, it means that these are not exactly bindingly my rules.
To support his position that the 10 commandments are not a set for sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. This interpretation of under the law is not an interpretation that originated with Winger, but has been often used previously by those arguing for the same or similar positions to Mike. In his commentary on Romans, Presbyterian scholar and minister Charles Cranfield notes that this phrase is widely taken to mean that the authority of the law has been abolished for believers and superseded by a different authority, and this, it must be admitted, would be a plausible interpretation if this sentence stood by itself. However, when read in the wider context of the letter to the Romans, this interpretation is ruled out. In Romans chapter 3 verse 31, Paul emphasizes that the faith through which the righteousness of God is received and which we are justified by apart from works of the law does not nullify the law, but rather upholds it. In Romans chapter 7 verse 12, Paul describes the law as holy, righteous, and good. And in Romans chapter 13 verses 8 to 10, Paul quotes and reaffirms the continuance of the 10 commandments. As Cranfield continues about Romans chapter 6 verse 14, but since it stands in a document which contains such things as chapter 3 verse 31, chapter 7 verse 12, verse 14a, chapter 8 verse 4, chapter 13 verses 8 to 10, and in which the law is referred to more than once as God's law and is appealed to again and again as authoritative, such a reading of it is extremely unlikely. What Paul is describing in Romans chapter 6 verse 14 is not that the law has lost its authority over Christians, but rather that sin, which had its reign through the law, has lost its authority with the substitutionary death of Jesus. This is indicated in the passages preceding and following this verse, where Paul describes how sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived him and through the commandment put him to death, and that those crucified with Christ are no longer slaves to sin. This is also indicated by Romans chapter 6 verse 14 itself, as being under grace denotes being under the favour of God, which is opposite to the condemnation of God. As scholar Tim Hegg writes, thus, when he concludes that the believer is not under the law but under grace, he is not putting the law and grace at odds with each other, but showing the means by which the believer is no longer a slave to sin, but instead is alive unto God. Here is the second argument Mike makes from Romans.
One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day, that would be observing the Sabbath, is a subcategory of observing the day. This 100% applies to the Sabbath. The one who observes the day, right? A person who observes Sabbath is observing a day that they esteem different than others. This is 100% applicable.
To argue that the New Testament teaches that Christians are not required to observe the Sabbath, Mike uses Romans chapter 14 verse 5. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Winger appears highly confident that his interpretation is accurate, which is an attitude previously cautioned against by Cranfield towards his contemporaries. Some recent commentators have exhibited great confidence in their approach to the interpretation of this section. This we find surprising, for it seems to us to be extremely difficult to decide with certainty what exactly the problem is with which Paul is concerned in this section. It should be recognised that it is debated amongst Christian theologians as to what Paul is addressing in this verse and the rest of chapter 14, and that there are several reasons why Winger's interpretation has often been rejected. One reason is, as previously shown, Paul continues to affirm the relevance and application of the law which contains the Sabbath. Another is that the Sabbath is not mentioned by Paul in this chapter or elsewhere in Romans. And a third is that Paul identifies the disputable matters at the beginning of this chapter as opinions, which rules out the Sabbath because it is a divine creation and instruction, not a human opinion. Regarding this latter point and Mike's claim that Romans chapter 14 verse 5 includes the Sabbath, scholar J.K. McKee states that the fact that what divided the Roman believers is labelled as opinion should cause all readers to slow down in quickly rushing to such a thought. A different understanding of Romans chapter 14 verse 5 is that Paul is referring to weekly fast days practiced in some Second Temple Judaisms. Jesus refers to the Pharisaical custom of fasting on the second and fifth days of the week, when in a parable he describes a Pharisee boasting about fasting twice a week. The Didache, a first century Christian manual, also affirms this tradition when the author warns Christians not to fast on the same weekdays. And an understanding of Romans chapter 14 verse 5 as concerning scheduled fasting days was taken by some ancient church writers, such as Augustine of Hippo and John Chrysostom. The context of Romans as a whole indicates that fast days are more probable to be what Paul is referring to. Other passages confirm that the Roman Church was comprised of both Jews and Gentiles, which means a disagreement over Jewish tradition was possible. And in Romans chapter 14, Paul describes how some Christians in the Roman Church have decided to abstain from eating, so an understanding that the days in Romans chapter 14 verse 5 are fasts would be consistent with Paul's writing, particularly when read with the following verse. Romans chapter 14 verse 6. The one who observes the day observes it in honour of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honour of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honour of the Lord and gives thanks to God. To conclude, in his first argument, Mike wrongly understands Romans chapter 6 verse 14 to be referring to the law, when it is referring to the power of sin, as the wider context of the letter to the Romans and the verse itself indicates. In his second argument, Winger incorrectly asserts that the Sabbath falls under Paul's direction in Romans chapter 14 verse 5, despite its absence from the whole letter and Paul's description of the disputed matter as a human opinion. This weakens the argument that Winger and others have made to rule out the Ten Commandments, including the seventh-day Sabbath, as applicable to Christians. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like it, and to be notified of new content, subscribe to the Pronomian Perspective.